The battlefield is a world unto itself, a realm of smoke and steel, of deafening thunder and chilling silence. It is a place where history is not written, but forged in the crucible of chaos, courage, and unimaginable terror. For 2 decades, one name dominated this world, his shadow falling across the continent of Europe like a colossus, Napoleon Bonaparte. But to understand the man, to grasp the sheer force of his genius and the depths of his ambition, we must look beyond the grand strategies and the casualty lists. We must venture into the heart of the storm itself. We must stand with him on the blood-soaked bridge at Lodi, feel the icy wind at Austerlitz, and hear the desperate cries in the snows of Russia. For it is in these moments, these fleeting, forgotten anecdotes of combat, that the true nature of Napoleon is revealed, not as a distant icon, but as a living, breathing man. A man who could calculate the trajectory of a cannonball and the breaking point of an empire with equal precision. A man who could inspire utter devotion in his soldiers, even as he led them into the jaws of death. This is the story of Napoleon on the battlefield, a story of tactical brilliance, of psychological warfare, of incredible gambles and devastating losses. A story of the human moments that decided the fate of nations, hidden within the epic saga of his wars. The legend begins not in a palace, but in the mud and chaos of a siege. Toulon, 1793. The French Revolution is in peril, and the port city has been handed over to the British by royalist rebels. A young, unknown artillery captain with a thick Corsican accent and a burning ambition arrives on the scene. His name is Napoleon Bonaparte. The French commanders are incompetent, their attacks sporadic and ineffective. Napoleon, with his encyclopedic knowledge of artillery, sees the strategic key to the city, a high point of land called L'Aiguillette, from which his cannons could dominate the harbor and force the British fleet to withdraw. His superiors dismiss his plan as reckless, but Napoleon is relentless. He argues, he cajoles, he persuades. Finally, he is given his chance. He works tirelessly, often sleeping on the ground next to his guns, sharing the rations and the dangers of his men. He is not just a commander, he is a soldier. During one assault, he is wounded in the thigh by a British bayonet, a scar he would carry for the rest of his life. But his plan works. The British fleet is forced to flee, and Toulon falls. In the aftermath, a young captain has become a brigadier general. The name Napoleon Bonaparte is spoken for the first time in the corridors of power. The world has not yet learned to fear it, but it will. The Italian campaign of 1796 is where the legend truly takes flight. Napoleon, now a general in command of a ragged, demoralized army, unleashes a whirlwind of energy and audacity that leaves his Austrian opponents bewildered. And at the Battle of Lodi, the world witnesses a moment that will define his public image forever. The French army is faced with a heavily defended bridge over the Oder River. The Austrian rearguard has placed their cannons to sweep the length of the bridge, a veritable death trap. A frontal assault seems suicidal, but Napoleon knows that victory here is not just a tactical objective, it is a psychological one. He needs to prove to his men and to himself that they are invincible. He gives the order to charge. At first, the French troops hesitate, faltering under the storm of Austrian canister shot. Then, Napoleon himself, along with his most trusted marshals, grabs a standard and rushes to the front, leading the charge in person. It is a moment of pure, electrifying courage. Inspired by their general's bravery, the French soldiers surge forward, overwhelming the Austrian defenders. The bridge is taken. That night, his soldiers, in a spontaneous display of affection and respect, give him a new name, Le Petit Caporal, the Little Corporal. It is a name that will follow him for the rest of his life, a symbol of the unique bond he forged with his men. He was no longer just their general, he was one of them. And in his own mind, something had shifted. As he would later write, "It was on that evening at Lodi that I came to believe in myself as an exceptional man, and the ambition came to me to do the great things that until then had been but a fantasy. But it was at the Battle of Arcole that this personal bravery was tested to its absolute limit. Once again, a bridge stood between Napoleon and victory. The Austrians were pouring a murderous fire onto the narrow causeway. The French attacks faltered, one after another. In a moment of desperation, Napoleon again grabs a flag and leads his men forward. But this time, the charge fails. The French are driven back, and in the chaos, Napoleon is knocked off the causeway and into the marshy ground below. He is trapped, sinking in the mud, his life in mortal danger. His aides-de-camp rush to his side, dragging him from the mire just as the Austrians launch a counterattack. It is a moment of utter humiliation, a stark reminder of his own mortality. But it is also a moment of profound significance. It shows a Napoleon who is not a god of war, but a man who can fall, who can fail, who can be brought low by the chaos of battle. And it is this very humanity, this willingness to share the dangers of his men, that inspires such fierce loyalty. They saw him not as a distant, untouchable commander, but as a brother in arms, a man who was willing to risk everything for victory. The masterpiece, the battle that would forever be associated with his name, was Austerlitz. December 2nd, 1805, the first anniversary of his coronation as emperor. Napoleon is facing a combined army of Austrians and Russians, a force that significantly outnumbers his own. He is in a perilous position, his lines of communication stretched thin, his enemies confident of victory. But Napoleon is a master of deception, a puppeteer who can make his opponents dance to his tune. He deliberately weakens his right flank, feigning a retreat, luring the Allies to attack. He abandons the strategic high ground of the Pratzen Heights, a move that seems like madness to his own marshals. The Allied commanders, Tsar Alexander of Russia and the Holy Roman Emperor Francis II, take the bait. They see an opportunity to crush Napoleon, to encircle his army and end the war in a single, decisive blow. As the sun rises on the morning of the battle, it burns through a thick fog, revealing the Allied columns descending from the heights, just as Napoleon had predicted. One sharp blow, he remarks to his marshals, and the war is over. He has them exactly where he wants them. He unleashes Marshal Soult's corps in a surprise attack on the now weakened Allied center, storming the Pratzen Heights and splitting the enemy army in two. The battle becomes a rout, a slaughter. The Allied left wing is trapped against a series of frozen lakes. Napoleon turns his artillery on the ice, shattering it and sending thousands of men and horses to a watery grave. It is a victory of breathtaking brilliance, a triumph of mind over matter, a testament to Napoleon's ability to see the battlefield not as it is, but as he wants it to be. The son of Austerlitz enters the Napoleonic legend, a symbol of his genius, his destiny, his invincibility. The brutal, bloody Battle of Eylau, fought in a blinding snowstorm in the depths of a Polish winter, tells a different story. This is not a story of brilliant maneuvers and decisive results. It is a story of sheer attritional butchery. The French and Russian armies stumble into each other and are locked in a desperate, chaotic struggle for survival. The battlefield is a frozen hell, the snow stained red with blood. At one point, the French center is broken, and Napoleon himself is in danger of being captured. He stands his ground, a small, solitary figure amidst the swirling snow and the chaos of battle, directing his reserves with an icy calm. It is Marshal Murat's epic cavalry charge, a thunderous avalanche of over 10,000 horsemen that saves the day, crashing into the Russian lines and buying Napoleon the time he needs to stabilize his front. The battle ends in a bloody stalemate, with tens of thousands of dead and wounded on both sides. The next morning, as Napoleon rides over the battlefield, he is visibly shaken by the carnage. The ground is littered with frozen corpses, the air filled with the groans of the dying. To see such a spectacle, he murmurs, is to be filled with a disgust for war. It is a rare moment of introspection, a glimpse of the man behind the mask of the conqueror, a man who is not immune to the human cost of his own ambition. The invasion of Russia in 1812 is the beginning of the end. It is a story of hubris, of overreach, of a man who believed his own legend. Napoleon assembles the largest European army ever seen, the Grande Armée, a force of over 500,000 men, and marches on Moscow. He is confident of a quick, decisive victory, but the Russians refuse to play by his rules. They retreat, drawing him deeper and deeper into the vast, empty expanse of the Russian heartland. They burn their own villages, destroy their own crops, leaving nothing for the invading army to live on. The Battle of Borodino, fought just outside Moscow, is a bloodbath, a Pyrrhic victory for the French. Napoleon enters a deserted, burning Moscow and waits for a peace proposal that never comes. He is trapped. As the brutal Russian winter sets in, he is forced to order a retreat. It is a retreat that will become a legend of human suffering. The Grande Armée, once the pride of Europe, is destroyed by starvation, by frostbite, by the relentless attacks of the Cossacks. Napoleon, who had always shared the hardships of his men, is forced to abandon them, racing back to Paris to raise a new army. He leaves behind a trail of frozen corpses, a testament to the catastrophic failure of his greatest gamble. The retreat from Moscow is a story of unimaginable horror, but it is also a story of incredible resilience. It is the story of Marshal Ney, the bravest of the brave, who commands the rear guard, fighting a desperate, hopeless battle to save the remnants of the army. It is the story of the soldiers who, even in the depths of their despair, never lose their faith in their emperor. It is a story that reveals the dark, destructive side of Napoleon's ambition, but also the incredible, unbreakable spirit of the men who followed him. And then there is Waterloo, the final act, the last gamble. Napoleon, escaped from his exile on Elba, has raised a new army and is once again on the march. He faces a coalition of British, Dutch, and Prussian forces under the command of the Duke of Wellington and Marshal Blucher. The fate of Europe hangs in the balance. The battle is a close-run thing, a damned near-run thing, as Wellington would later call it. Napoleon is not the man he once was. He is sick, tired, his genius dimmed by years of war and exile. He makes a series of uncharacteristic mistakes. He delays the start of the battle, waiting for the ground to dry. He launches a series of frontal assaults on the well-defended British lines, a tactic that is both costly and ineffective. He entrusts a crucial part of the battle to Marshal Ney, who leads a series of brave, but ultimately futile, cavalry charges. As the day wears on, the French army begins to falter. The arrival of the Prussians on their right flank turns the tide. The Imperial Guard, Napoleon's elite, his immortals, is sent in for one last desperate charge. They are repulsed. The cry, "La Garde recule!" The Guard retreats, sends a shockwave of panic through the French army. The retreat becomes a rout. Napoleon, his face a mask of despair, is swept from the field, a defeated man. Waterloo is the end of the Napoleonic dream, the final, bloody chapter in the story of a man who had, for a brief, brilliant moment, held the world in the palm of his hand. From the mud of Toulon to the snows of Russia, from the bridge at Lodi to the fields of Waterloo, the battles of Napoleon Bonaparte are more than just a series of military engagements. They are a window into the soul of a man of incredible genius and incredible flaws, a man who could inspire both love and fear, a man who changed the face of Europe forever. The anecdotes of his campaigns, the small, forgotten moments of courage and of cruelty, of triumph and of tragedy, reveal a man who was not a god, but a human being. A man who was, in the end, as much a victim of his own ambition as he was its master. The story of Napoleon on the battlefield is a story of the human condition, of the eternal struggle between our highest aspirations and our darkest impulses. It is a story that continues to fascinate us, to inspire us, and to haunt us. It is a story that is, in the end, the story of ourselves. But to truly understand the depth of his military genius, we must return to the Italian campaign, to the Battle of Rivoli. Here, Napoleon faced a desperate situation. His small army caught between two much larger Austrian forces. It was a moment that would have broken a lesser commander, but for Napoleon, it was an opportunity. He demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to move his troops with incredible speed, to be everywhere at once. He fought a series of engagements over a period of 3 days, marching and counter-marching his men, never allowing the Austrians to unite their forces. He was a whirlwind of energy, a blur of motion, a man who seemed to defy the very laws of time and space. At the decisive moment, he unleashed a surprise cavalry charge that shattered the Austrian lines and secured a stunning victory. Rivoli was a masterpiece of maneuver, a testament to Napoleon's ability to think and act faster than his opponents. It was a battle that was won not with brute force, but with speed, with deception, with the sheer, unstoppable power of his will. The twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt, fought on the same day in 1806, were a demonstration of the awesome power of the French military machine that Napoleon had created. At Jena, Napoleon crushed a Prussian army, his infantry, cavalry, and artillery working in perfect, deadly harmony. But it was at Auerstedt that the true quality of his army was revealed. There, Marshal Davout, with a single French corps, faced the main Prussian army, a force more than twice its size. For hours, Davout's men held their ground against overwhelming odds, their discipline and their courage, a testament to the training and the spirit that Napoleon had instilled in them. When Napoleon heard of Davout's victory, he was at first incredulous. "Your marshal must have been seeing double," he remarked. But when the reports were confirmed, he was filled with admiration. Jena was a victory of genius, but Auerstedt was a victory of the system, a victory of the army that Napoleon had built in his own image. It was a victory that sent a shockwave across Europe, a victory that announced the arrival of a new and terrible power on the world stage. The Battle of Wagram, fought in 1809, was a battle of giants, a clash of two massive armies on the plains of the Danube. It was a battle of attrition, a brutal, bloody, slugging match that lasted for 2 days. Napoleon, for the first time, was forced to rely on sheer numbers, on the brute force of his artillery, to achieve victory. He assembled a massive grand battery of over 100 cannons and pounded the Austrian lines for hours, a relentless, deafening bombardment that shattered their morale and paved the way for his final, decisive assault. Wagram was a victory, but it was a costly one. The French army suffered heavy casualties, and the old élan, the old spirit of the revolutionary armies, was gone. The Grande Armée was no longer an army of citizen soldiers fighting for liberty and for glory. It was an imperial army, an army of conscripts, an army that was beginning to show the strains of a decade of constant warfare. Wagram was a victory, but it was also a warning, a sign that the Napoleonic Empire, for all its power and its glory, was built on a foundation of sand. The Peninsular War, the long, brutal conflict in Spain and Portugal, was a running sore, a cancer that ate away at the strength of the French Empire. It was a new kind of war, a people's war, a war of ambushes and assassinations, a war that Napoleon, for all his genius, could not win. He called it his Spanish Ulcer, a conflict that drained his resources, tied down his best troops, and gave his enemies a new and powerful weapon, the weapon of nationalism. The battles of the Peninsular War were not the grand set-piece battles that Napoleon was used to. They were small, nasty, brutal affairs, fought in the mountains and the valleys of a hostile and unforgiving land. They were battles that were won not with brilliant maneuvers, but with sheer, dogged determination. They were battles that showed the limits of Napoleon's power, the limits of his genius, the limits of his empire. And they were battles that would ultimately contribute to his downfall. The Battle of Leipzig, the Battle of Nations, was the beginning of the end of the Napoleonic Empire in Germany. For 3 days in October 1813, over 500,000 men from almost every nation in Europe clashed in a titanic struggle for the fate of the continent. It was the largest battle in European history before World War I, a maelstrom of fire and steel, a symphony of destruction. Napoleon, with his back to the wall, fought with the desperation of a cornered lion. He was outnumbered, outgunned, his army a shadow of its former self. But he was still Napoleon. He was still the master of the battlefield. He launched a series of brilliant counterattacks, his young, inexperienced conscripts fighting with the courage of veterans. But it was not enough. The sheer weight of numbers was against him. On the third day of the battle, his Saxon allies, in the middle of the fighting, defected to the enemy, a betrayal that sealed his fate. The French army was forced to retreat, a retreat that quickly became a rout. Leipzig was a catastrophic defeat, a defeat that shattered the myth of Napoleon's invincibility, a defeat that marked the beginning of his final, inexorable slide towards abdication and exile. It was a battle that showed that even the greatest of military geniuses cannot defy the laws of arithmetic, the logic of numbers, the tide of history. It was a battle that was lost not on the battlefield, but in the hearts and minds of the German people, a people who had finally risen up to throw off the yoke of their French oppressor. It was a battle that was a testament to the power of nationalism, a power that Napoleon had unwittingly unleashed, a power that would ultimately consume him. The retreat from Leipzig was a scene of chaos and despair, a grim echo of the retreat from Moscow. The French army, shattered and demoralized, was harried every step of the way by the victorious Allies. A single bridge, blown up too soon, trapped thousands of French soldiers on the wrong side of the river, a final, tragic blunder in a campaign that was full of them. Napoleon, his face a mask of grim resignation, could only watch as his empire crumbled around him. The Battle of Nations was over, and the age of Napoleon was drawing to a close. Let us not forget the Battle of Marengo, a battle that could have ended Napoleon's career before it had truly begun. In 1800, as first consul of France, he led his army across the Alps in a daring surprise attack on the Austrians in Italy. But at Marengo, he was caught off guard. His army outnumbered and outmaneuvered. By the early afternoon, the battle was all but lost. The French were in full retreat, the Austrians confident of victory. A messenger was dispatched to Vienna to announce the defeat of Bonaparte, but Napoleon refused to accept defeat. "The battle is lost," he told his marshals, "but there is still time to win another." He rallied his retreating troops, his presence alone enough to turn the tide of despair. And then, at the 11th hour, a fresh French division under General Desaix arrived on the battlefield. Desaix, a brilliant and beloved commander, surveyed the scene and gave his famous assessment. This battle is completely lost. However, there is time to win another. He led his men in a desperate counterattack, a charge that would snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. But it was a victory that came at a terrible price. Desaix was killed at the head of his men, a hero's death that left Napoleon heartbroken. "Why am I not allowed to weep?" he lamented, a rare public display of emotion. Marengo was a victory that was born of a defeat, a victory that was a testament to Napoleon's resilience, his refusal to give up, even when all seemed lost. It was a victory that cemented his power as first consul, a victory that paved the way for the creation of the French Empire. But it was a victory that was forever tinged with sadness, a victory that was a reminder of the human cost of his ambition. The Battle of Friedland, fought in 1807, was another masterpiece of Napoleonic warfare, a battle that was as decisive as it was brilliant. Napoleon, facing a Russian army under the command of General Bennigsen, saw an opportunity to trap and destroy his enemy. The Russians had crossed a river to attack a small French force. Their backs to the water, their lines of retreat precarious. Napoleon, with his customary speed, concentrated his forces and launched a devastating attack on the Russian left flank. The Russian army was shattered, driven into the river, their defeat absolute. Friedland was a victory that was a testament to Napoleon's eye for terrain, his ability to see and to exploit the mistakes of his opponents. It was a victory that led to the Treaty of Tilsit, a treaty that marked the high point of the Napoleonic Empire, a treaty that divided Europe between the Emperor of the West and the Tsar of the East. It was a victory that seemed to confirm Napoleon's status as the master of Europe, the undisputed arbiter of the fate of nations. But it was a victory that was built on a foundation of hubris, a victory that sowed the seeds of its own destruction. For in the moment of his greatest triumph, Napoleon had made a fatal mistake. He had underestimated the resilience of his enemies, the power of their hatred, the depth of their desire for revenge, and he had overestimated the strength of his own alliance with the Tsar of Russia, an alliance that was as fragile as the ice on which it was built. The road from Tilsit, from the pinnacle of power, would lead, inexorably, to the snows of Russia, to the fields of Leipzig, to the final, bloody denouement at Waterloo. The story of Napoleon's battles is a story of a man who flew too close to the sun, a man whose genius was matched only by his ambition, a man whose triumphs were as spectacular as his failures were catastrophic. It is a story that is a timeless and a universal one, a story that will continue to be told as long as there are men who dare to dream of glory, of power, and of immortality. We see this even in the smallest moments. During the Battle of Wagram, Napoleon, exhausted, fell asleep on his horse. His soldiers, seeing their emperor's fatigue, formed a silent circle around him, their bayonets a wall of steel to protect him as he slept. It was a small, quiet moment in the midst of a titanic struggle, a testament to the deep, almost paternal love that his men felt for him. And there is the story of the Dog of Marengo, a stray that followed the French army and that stood guard over the body of his dead master after the battle, licking his wounds, his mournful howls a lonely lament in the silence of the battlefield. Napoleon, seeing the dog's devotion, was moved to tears, a rare display of emotion for a man who had seen so much death, so much suffering. These are the moments that reveal the man behind the legend, the man who was not just a conqueror, but a human being, a man who was capable of both great cruelty and great compassion. These are the stories that give a human face to the epic and the terrible story of the Napoleonic Wars. And what of the men who followed him, the legendary marshals of the empire? Men like Lannes, the fiery Gascon, Napoleon's closest friend, who died in his arms at the Battle of Aspern-Essling, his legs shattered by a cannonball. A man whose death left Napoleon utterly devastated, a rare moment of personal grief for the emperor. Or Davout, the Iron Marshal, the victor of Auerstedt, a man of unshakable discipline and loyalty, a man who was perhaps the most capable of all of Napoleon's subordinates, and nay, the bravest of the brave, the hero of the retreat from Moscow, a man whose courage was as legendary as his temper was volatile. These were the men who were the instruments of Napoleon's will, the men who translated his genius into victory on the battlefield. They were a band of brothers, a new aristocracy of talent, a testament to the revolutionary idea that a man should be judged not by his birth, but by his ability. Their stories are an integral part of the Napoleonic legend, a story of loyalty, of ambition, of courage, and of betrayal. A story of men who rose from obscurity to become princes and dukes, a story of men who, in the end, were as much a part of the Napoleonic myth as the emperor himself. Their relationship with Napoleon was a complex one, a mixture of awe, of fear, of love, and of resentment. They were his comrades in arms, but they were also his subjects. They owed him everything, and they knew it. But they also knew that he would not hesitate to sacrifice them for his own ambition. It was a devil's bargain, a pact that they had all made with the man who had promised them glory and who had delivered on that promise, but at a terrible and an ultimate price. The story of Napoleon's battles is not just a story of a man, but of an army that was a reflection of its leader, an army that was, for a brief, glorious moment, the most powerful fighting force on the face of the earth. It is a story that is written in the blood and the sweat and the tears of millions of men, a story that is a testament to the enduring and the terrible power of war. And so, the legend endures. The name of Napoleon Bonaparte continues to echo through the centuries, a name that is synonymous with war, with ambition, with genius, and with tragedy. His battles are studied in military academies around the world, his strategies and his tactics a source of endless fascination and debate. But it is in the human stories, in the small, forgotten moments of the battlefield, that we find the true measure of the man. A man who was a son, a husband, a father, a friend. A man who was a soldier, a general, an emperor. A man who was a hero and a tyrant. A man who was, in the end, a man. And it is this man, in all his complexity, in all his contradictions, that we seek to understand, to remember, and to learn from. For the story of Napoleon is not just a story of the past, it is a story of the present and of the future. It is a story that reminds us of the terrible beauty and the terrible cost of war. It is a story that reminds us of the enduring power of the human spirit, for good and for ill. It is a story that will never die. The final echoes of the guns of Waterloo have long since faded into silence. The great empires that clashed on those bloody fields have crumbled into dust. But the story of Napoleon, the story of the man who bent the will of a continent to his own, the story of the man who rose from nothing to become a god of war, that story will live forever. It is a story that is carved into the very landscape of Europe, in the names of bridges and of squares, in the monuments and the museums that commemorate his victories and his defeats. It is a story that is woven into the fabric of our modern world, in the laws that he created, in the institutions that he built, in the very idea of what it means to be a nation. But most of all, it is a story that lives on in the human heart, in our capacity for greatness and for destruction, in our endless fascination with the man who was and who remains the ultimate embodiment of the human will to power. And in the end, perhaps that is the most enduring legacy of Napoleon Bonaparte. Not the empires he built or the battles he won, but the story he left behind. A story that is as grand, as tragic, and as human as any that has ever been told. It is a story that speaks to the warrior, the dreamer, the builder, and the tyrant in all of us. It is a story that will be told and retold for as long as humanity continues to grapple with the timeless questions of power, of ambition, and of destiny. His life was a testament to the idea that a single individual, through the force of their will, can change the course of history. But it is also a cautionary tale, a reminder that the same qualities that can lead to greatness can also lead to ruin. And that is why, more than 2 centuries after his death, we continue to be fascinated by Napoleon Bonaparte. For in his story, we see a reflection of ourselves, of our own hopes, our own fears, our own capacity for both creation and destruction. And in the end, that is the most powerful story of all. It is a story that transcends time and space, a story that speaks to the very core of what it means to be human, and it is a story that will continue to be told for as long as there are stories to be told. The story of Napoleon is the story of us.